Welcome to the session, Hooks and Events, an overview. This is how complex systems communicate. My name is Jonathan Daggerhart, and I am an architect at Hook 42, longtime Drupal and WordPress developer, and Twitter user and blogger is what this slide is letting us know. Also, I'm an organizer of Drupalcamp Asheville, which is in July this year. Just think about it. So what this session is going to cover is, first of all, the concepts of an event system in general. I want to break it down into what components make up an event system that are shared amongst all these implementations of event systems. I'm going to try to sort of like bring that information home with an analogy that all of us should be somewhat familiar with, and then we're actually going to look through each of the event systems that are common in our work, which is Drupal 7, Drupal 8, WordPress, and JavaScript. And what I hope to show through these examples isn't, we're going to see a lot of code and a lot of technical talk, I guess, but it's not to memorize what's on the screen. I'm wanting to show how similar all of these things are together. So if you understand the concepts, you actually are halfway there to understanding each of these systems. First of all, what is an event system? So the way I struggled with this definition and came to is, it's an implementation of a programming pattern that allows smaller components of a complicated framework to communicate with each other, modify shared data, and otherwise react to changes performed on the system. So if you replace the word components in this sentence with modules or themes, then we're on the same page. So this allows disparate parts to communicate. So what problems does an event system solve? Why do we have them? Well, without an event system, you end up with very tightly coupled components. You have lots of modules that have to communicate directly with each other. What an event system hopes to solve is to loosely couple the system so everything doesn't have to know about each other. Instead, everything can just subscribe to and dispatch events that other parts of the system can become aware of and react to. It allows, practically what this means is that it also allows the greater system to communicate and modify data, a lot like that definition I just read, with the greater system in a way that results in fewer conflicts and errors. So, great. What does that really mean? And what I'd like to do is, let's imagine a world where we have a complicated Drupal site or WordPress site that doesn't have hooks. How are you going to program a module or a theme that takes advantage of a very complicated system if you don't have hooks and you don't have an event system? Well, what you would have to do is you would have to override almost everything every time you want to make a change. If you had a shopping cart and you wanted to check out, and you wanted to modify in your theme the way the email looks when you check out in the shopping cart, then you're going to have to, with your theme, completely override parts of the checkout process because you don't have a way to respond to a tiny event, which is the completion of checkout. So if you've worked with Drupal sites or WordPress sites and you have made use of hooks at all, then I don't think it's a big leap to imagine a world where you don't have them and you suddenly become lost in the complexity of the system. So first thing I want to do is break down the system and get really specific with some vocabulary. What we're dealing with here is essentially a verb and a bunch of nouns that come together to form what I am calling an event system. The event itself is a verb. It is the change that happened. It is a force that modified the system. In a JavaScript way, it's really easy to picture because it's a user interface. A click is an event. That is a thing that happened. The rest of these are parts of the system that you sort of need to have a good event system that is cohesive and easy to work with. So we have the event context. This is the details about the event. This is what was clicked, for example. We have the event subscriber. This is the part of the system that wants to know about events. So this is something that says, let me know if X was clicked. We have a registry, which is just a list of subscribers. And we have the dispatcher, which is the part of the system that says, okay, an event happened, I'm going to let all the subscribers know about it. So that's the terminology you're going to hear a lot of in the next few minutes. And the analogy I'm going to use to illustrate this is a newspaper. So a newspaper starts first, so the issuing of a newspaper itself is an event. So let's imagine a world where a new newspaper edition is hot off the presses. That is the event. The context in this situation is the paper itself. It contains stories, articles, opinions, advertisement, comic strips, crossword puzzles. This is the context of the event of a new newspaper edition comes out. The subscribers in this example are the homes that have paid to receive this newspaper edition. It's literally a bunch of addresses. The registry is just the book that the newspaper company keeps as a list of their subscribers. And finally, we have the event dispatcher, which is this kid who goes around house to house delivering context, in this case the newspaper, to the subscribers, the homes. So now in that same picture that we saw before, I've just relabeled everything using that analogy. So the event, this is all what I just went through. The event is the newspaper came out. The context is the paper. Then you have the delivery person who goes through the registry, house to house, and delivers that context to each of these sleepy town folk getting their coffee in the morning. So it took me a while to come to this, but I think this hopefully illustrates the pieces in a really sort of tangible way that we all can relate to. The next thing I want to do is go through these event systems that we work with every day. And we're going to now identify things on a technical level. I'm no longer dealing with newspapers, but maybe that analogy will help go through this. And what I'm going to do is we want to explore each of these systems and identify the context, the subscriber, the registry, the dispatcher, and the event itself, and how all of these parts are the same concepts in these systems. Start with Drupal hooks. So Drupal hooks have been around since Drupal, let's say 0, and they're still here in Drupal 8. A Drupal hook looks a lot like this. It is a function that you write that has a specific name. The definition of a Drupal hook, this function, contains these three elements, these three parts of an event, of the event system. It is, the function itself is the event subscriber. The way the function is written in Drupal signifies the event it is subscribing to. So in this case, I have a theme or a module named example, and it is subscribing, it wants to subscribe to the event of help. And so for Drupal, we write a function named module event name. The context for our subscriber is all the parameters that are passed into this function. So in the case of each event has its own set of context. Each event, and what this should illustrate is that the context for each event changes because what you care about, what the subscriber needs to know and care about concerning the event, changes based on the event. So this pattern holds true for all of Drupal hooks. In Drupal, the hook registry is actually stored as an array in the database. You can find this array serialized at this location in the table called cache bootstrap under the ID of module implements. And it is literally an array of hooks, and that array contains another array of modules or themes that implement that hook. Note how it's stored in the cache table. This is why you have to clear caches to define a new hook in Drupal. Because if it were not stored in the cache table, then there would be a lot of overhead on every single page load. Because of the way Drupal does hooks, for it to go through every single module you have enabled, every single possible hook it could subscribe to, and build that list on each page load. So they have saved a bit of that work by caching it after it happens each time. In the case of a event dispatcher is a function in Drupal called module invokes all, which you essentially run. This is how you execute a hook if you are a module developer or a core developer, and this is how you would execute or call the hook, invoke the hook, this help, and you would pass in the context that you need to send to each of the describers. So the event dispatcher has the event name, you give it the event name and the context, and the dispatcher essentially, well, in basically every case we'll see, it does a loop through a list of all of the hooks in the registry, and then it calls each of those functions and passes in the context. So this thing that we see here, for each, some list of subscribers, and then call user function with that, the name of the subscriber and passing in the context, is what we're going to see a number more times. And those are all the parts of the Drupal 7 hook system, like laid bare pretty much. So let's take a look. What's similar to that is the WordPress hook system. So let's take a look at WordPress hooks. Again, actually not again, but for the first time, the word hooks is interchangeable with the word events, essentially. I don't know why necessarily they went with the word hooks 15 years ago when defining these systems, but had they gone with the word events, it would have been okay. It's the exact same thing. In Drupal 8, we have a new system called events, which works a different way, which we'll see next, but there's nothing special about the word hook. Just wanted to throw that out there. So when designing a WordPress hook, it looks a lot like a Drupal hook. So here's an example of a WordPress hook where we define a subscriber. We talk about what context is expected in this subscriber, and then we register our subscriber with a specific event by name. So it's a little different. In WordPress, the name of the function doesn't matter at all, because the way we register, it's not automatically detected the way Drupal 7 automatically looks for certain names. Instead, the way we register a subscriber is by using a function to register the subscribers. So in this example, I tried to illustrate that by naming my function. I can name this anything, and then down here beneath the function, I run add action, where I tell it the event that I want to subscribe to and the name of the function that is the subscriber. In this case, the event I subscribe to is pre-get post, and the context that pre-get post event will deliver to the subscriber is the WP query object.
Not being a WordPress developer, I assume there's a list of event hooks that can be subscribed to.
Yes.
Some documentation somewhere.
Yes, there is. So I don't know that I have that in my references slide at the end. The question was, is there a list of events in WordPress that you can subscribe to? And the way I find it each time is by searching for WordPress action reference. And if that's not in my list of references at the end of the presentation, I'll add it before I upload it to the website.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So in WordPress, the event registry, rather than being a cell in a table in a database, is actually a global variable that is an array. And it is built each time that the page is loaded. It is stateless in that every time you register a new hook on the next page load, it is found. Well, it's not found, it's made aware of it. So WordPress can get away with this because we must explicitly subscribe a function to an event. In Drupal, it must go through and detect every possible events that every module could subscribe to, and that's a lot of work. But in WordPress, we say, no, then one-to-one, I want this function to subscribe to that event. And so each page load, the add action or add filter method or function loads the global WP filter array, and basically just adds our subscriber to that array. And I wrote a little method up here. I tried to simulate I had the database query for finding the Drupal actions or the Drupal hooks. And here's just a way you could theoretically just sort of prove this point. You could get the global WP filter array and then just dump it in the footer of your site if you wanted to prove this to yourself. The event dispatcher in WordPress is just another function like module invokes all, except instead it is apply filters, and these take very, very similar arguments. So apply filter, the first parameter is the name of the event that we're subscribing, the name of the event that we want to invoke or share throughout the system, and the rest of it, everything after that is the context. So there's actually two parts of this, and we can't see it all on the screen, but this is just sort of showing the apply filters function. Really what I want to get down to is what happens here, which I am pointing to near the very bottom where a class apply filters method is called. And so I'd like to show that this part of the method does exactly what module invoke all did. Ultimately, it comes down to a for each loop that loops through every function that is registered in every subscriber that is a part of the registry, and then it calls the user function on that subscriber, passing in the context. For each, call user function. Same thing we just saw in Drupal. So what about Drupal 8 events, which are really Symfony events? So with Drupal 8, we brought a whole second event system into Drupal. So, we also have the Drupal hooks. They're available. You still use those. I don't see those going away anytime soon. But with the inclusion of Symfony, we've added a new system that we are calling events to keep distinct from hooks. We is a strong word. I had nothing to do with it. So let's look at what an event looks like. So here we start to break away a little bit away from defining a function or a callable as a individual subscriber. And instead what we have is a class that can contain any number of subscriptions. So when we are creating a new subscriber in Drupal 7, we'll name a function. In Drupal 8 as an event, we'll make a class. And in this class, we'll contain a method that returns an array that maps event name to method on this class. So in this case, in this example, this class here says that on the event of config.save, register or execute call my method, which I've defined lower, as a subscriber to that event. And then that method expects the event context, which in the case of Drupal 8 events is an object. That object, depending on the event itself, that object will contain data that your subscriber needs to know or care about the event. So for example, this is subscribing to a config.save event, and I know that the config event is passing an object that has a method helping me get config and some other useful information about that event. So that's just what a subscriber looks like in the context. And here in that first function, we name the event. Your subscriber class can subscribe to any number of events. You just need to supply an array, a event name mapped to a method on that class. So registering an event subscriber is closer to WordPress, where you actually do this second thing to register the event subscriber. It's not automatically detected by the system the same way a Drupal 7 hook is. And the way we register our subscribers is with the services YAML file in our module. So the easiest, this contains a few examples. These are all examples of different classes that are subscribers to events. The easiest one to look at here would be the one in the middle. Another config event subscriber is a one that's a little simplified to look at because it doesn't have all the comments, the code comments. And essentially what this comes down to is you name a class, you point to it through its namespace, and then you tag it, and one of those tags has the name event subscriber. Now when Drupal loads the system, it finds every service that includes the tag named event subscriber, and it registers it for you. So this is how we made a class, and then we register that class with our services YAML.
Can you go back to the previous?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm disrupting your presentation. So the registration is a combination of putting it in the services file and then setting up the get subscribe events
Yes.
method that is part of the interface. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the question is just to verify that the definition includes registering a class here in the services.yaml, and that class contains this method, get subscribed events. And the reason that class knows or must contain that method is because this class implements the event subscriber interface. This interface says your class must define that method. Yes, that is how it all knows. So the event dispatcher. And the event dispatcher in the case of Symfony events is another service defined in Drupal globally as the name event dispatcher. This is a contrived example where we are going to just go get that service named event dispatcher, which is not a common thing you'll have to do unless you're writing modules. But you'll go get the service being a fancy word for helper class. You'll go get that helper class that is an event dispatcher, and then you will run its method dispatch. You'll name your event, and then you'll pass in the context. In this case, the context is an object full of information about your event. So the signature here should be very familiar. It is just like module invokes all, just like apply filters. The very first parameter is the name of your event, and everything else is the context that you'll deliver to each subscriber. And if we go deeper and we look at that class, that event dispatcher service, we'll see, surprise, surprise, it contains an array named listeners. And in this array, we keep a map of all of the subscribers and the events that these subscribers subscribe to. Also in this class, the event dispatcher service is what we're looking at. There's a method called dispatch, which previously is what we showed. And what it expects is an event name to be dispatched, an event object, which is your context. It contains all the data about the event that subscribers care about. And then, look at this. It does a for each loop through an array of listeners. And it calls with call user function each subscriber that was registered for this event, passing in the context of that subscriber. So what we've seen now 3 times in a row, that these systems boil down to an array that is a list of functions, and then another function that does a loop on that array, calling all the functions and passing in parameters. All of these things are very, very simple, and that is a point. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Your array of, I'm sorry, I've never written an event list, or I've never written this in Drupal before.
Sure.
So, do you have any control over the order of execution of the event listeners in your array?
Yes, you do. And I didn't include that in this because I didn't know how long this would take, but all of these systems, every single system we've talked about has a concept that's not represented here, which is generally called priority. It is the order in which your subscribers are activated or are called when an event is dispatched. So in the case of Drupal 7, that priority is defined by something called a module weight. Has anybody in here ever dealt with module weights before? Yes. So what you'll be familiar with is that in the case of module weights, you are controlling the priority of every single hook in your module with one number. So if you have a module, if you need to define 2 hooks, one that happens very early in the process and one that happens very late, you pretty much the easiest way to do that is to put them in two separate modules, defining module A's weight to be very low and module B's weight to be very high. It's not ideal. I'm just explaining the way it is, not the way it should be. In the case of WordPress and the new events in Symfony, when registering your event, so I don't illustrate this, but I could sort of go back here to when registering your event, add action, this example at the bottom left, is there are actually two additional parameters you can pass into the add action when you're registering your subscriber, rather. And the fourth one is the priority, where a lower number happens earlier and a higher number happens later. So in Drupal hooks, if you wanted to subscribe to the exact same event twice, you have to define two modules, because you can't have two different functions, one that happens early and one that happens late, in the same module. It's basically impossible, or it's very hard. There might be ways around it now. Has anybody here ever defined a module named ZZZ_custom? Okay, because the default is alphabetical. So sometimes you'll find modules in old systems named AAA something or ZZZ something, and that's a weird workaround people have done. But so say you wanted to subscribe to hook form alter twice in a website. You cannot do that in Drupal 7 in one module. You have to do it in two different places. And that's because the naming convention of your subscribers is one module to one hook. Whereas and your hooks or your subscribers adopt the priority, which is the module weight of that one module. Whereas in WordPress, we're jumping all over the place here, I could write any number of functions and then register them individually to the exact same event over and over again, passing them a different priority each time. This is also true about Drupal 8 events, Symfony events. It's just so in this case, it's the fourth parameter of the add action function where you're registering your subscriber. But in the case of Symfony events, it becomes a part of this array that you return. And I believe the syntax is the key is still the event name, and then the value of that key for get subscribed events is an array where the first item is the method and the second item is the priority. So in the case of a Drupal 8 event, much closer to WordPress hooks than Drupal hooks, because you could have multiple subscribers subscribe to one event in the same module, and each could have its own priority that it needs to be concerned about, as opposed to the module's overall relationship, its weight in the system. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that is the PHP where, and I hope what we got out of that was that these are all very similar. The concepts are the same across the board. So now let's look at one more that's a little odd, but guess what? The concepts are the same. And that's JavaScript events, specifically for the web. What I mean by for the web is this is not Node.js. This is Browsers.js. So in the case of JavaScript, here's an example of an event subscriber that is subscribed to a specific event and its context. So I have defined a new function that expects a parameter which I have defined here as event context. And then I said this function should subscribe to an event called click. So I've done this here in document query selector. I went and got a part of the DOM, and I said that part of the DOM subscribes to an event named click, and the subscriber is this function that I just defined. The event context in the case of JavaScript is a common object that's passed into your function when that event occurs. And this object is full of information. Like, this doesn't show even half of it. It's a very big object generally, and it's full of exactly what you need to know or want to know about that event. So this is a great example of illustrating that context is really about the event itself. So what we have here, I believe what I wanted here, what am I seeing here? It is showing the position, I don't remember which part of these, but some of these numbers here, the X and the Y, I don't remember which one. It's showing the position of the element that was clicked. You can get where the mouse was when the click event happened. You can get exactly which element was clicked, in this case the div called target, and lots of other stuff. So the context in the case of JavaScript events is a type of object that comes with lots of information as well as methods that are useful for responding to that event. And what's a little tricky about JavaScript is the event registry. The DOM itself is the event registry in JavaScript. There's not necessarily a centralized location. There's not one array. But what this means is that we register events throughout the entire DOM depending on what cares about the event. So we could do this globally by registering an event on the document itself or on the window, or we can go all the way down to a single element and we can say this element cares about that event, and it cares about it by subscribing to it. So here's an example where I have that same subscriber registered at the top, and I'm actually exploring with the inspector in Firefox. I'm exploring the DOM, and you can see the events that are registered on these things. This second screenshot in the middle is showing my exact example where I have a div named target, because I went and got with document query selector div.target, add event listener, click the name of my event, my subscriber, the name of my function, and then in the DOM we can see like that event is attached to that object. That object's destroyed, so is the event. And that event, it shows this is sort of Firefox doing a lot of work for me. You can actually see the function here in the DOM. This third screenshot is from Twitter, I think. And what I really wanted to illustrate here was just that one part of the DOM can subscribe to hundreds of events, lots and lots. So in this case, I ran out of space, and I just wanted to show that this one div is subscribing to at least 6 different events, and I promise you that before I cropped this picture, it was more like 30. So very complicated JavaScript systems have lots of events attached all over the DOM, and the DOM itself is the registry. That's sort of the point here. So what is the dispatcher in the case of JavaScript events? Well, it's actually the browser itself, and this is why I narrowed the scope of this part of the presentation to web events. Or it's one of the reasons. The browsers are what mediates the event occurrence and the dispatching of the event to all of the subscribers. It is the browser that knows where the user clicked. And the browser then says like, okay, well, this thing was clicked and it or its parents have subscribers for this click event, and so I need to dispatch this event with all of its context to all of the functions. So this also explains why back in the day, it may not be as much of a problem now, but it definitely is still an issue, especially if you support older IE. This explains why JavaScript works differently in different browsers, because the browsers implement the event dispatcher. So way back in the day, there was no agreement about how this should happen. And now there's much more agreement. There are agreed upon APIs and standards that all the browsers are trying to implement. And when you have a difference between the way one browser works with the JavaScript event now as opposed to before, it's likely a bug because they've agreed on how it should work. And then you have people like Google who's like, I'm going to make my own system. And Google's just sort of out there making JavaScript do what it wants it to do. So here's a gotcha. This is just a little sliding this one in the presentation. So in JavaScript world, you actually have event subscribers that are nested within other event subscribers. So you end up with a situation where you have to when you have a whole bunch of things subscribing to a click event that are nested inside of other things subscribing to the click event, then you have a cascade of events being dispatched to a whole lot of different subscribers. And so it was basically, my understanding of it is that it was a not well thought out part of JavaScript from the very, very beginning. And the solution that you've probably found yourself using over and over again from Stack Overflow, or maybe you remember it by now, is the event context itself has a method on it called stop propagation. That's how you say, like, actually all I really cared, the button was clicked, that's all I care about, stop propagation. Now I'm going to write my JavaScript function to react to the event the way I cared about. I don't want that section to respond. I don't want that div to respond. I don't bubble this event up, which is another sort of part of it. So that's just one little weird gotcha. The other event systems didn't really have nested events, so I just thought throw that one in there. Recap. All right. So now that we've taken this tour of event system, and I hope that we've seen that they're all very, very similar. So regardless of the framework, event systems are a concept that share lots of the same ideas, lots of the components. These ideas, boiled down as low as I can go, are subscribers are functions or callables, they're methods. That a registry is just a collection of subscribers, often just an array. The context is just the data that the subscribers want to know about. Easiest way to think about that one is a click event. Like, you really want to know what was clicked and where it was clicked and when it was clicked. And a dispatcher simply loops through the registry, calling the subscribers and passing in the context. These are all the same. Any questions? Yes?
In JavaScript, how easy is it to set your own custom events?
So the question is, in JavaScript, how easy is it to define new events? Right, yes. So, pretty easy. So there's another method called, okay, actually, let me take one tiny step back. I know how to do that in jQuery. So let me answer that question from the perspective of jQuery. In jQuery, there is a method called trigger, which is an event dispatcher. And you can trigger some event name, which is a string, just like all the other event strings, whenever you want. So you would basically say, like, get this element, trigger this event by name, pass in this context. So if you look at, most often I've seen this done in older sort of, what was it called? What was that JavaScript framework that everybody was using? Backbone? Like 10 years ago? So in Backbone, they did a lot, I saw lots of people defining lots of their own events and basically creating a complex system using those events. And I would guess, and I'll verify after this presentation, that there is actually a core browser method that you can trigger any event of any name, just like I'm familiar with in jQuery. Any other questions? I haven't checked the time.
You got plenty of time.
Oh yeah, all right.
Stop.
All right, song and dance, yes.
For Drupal 9, do you know if they're going to be deprecating the hook system, or if you have any idea?
I highly doubt it. So the last I looked, I have a blog post on hooks where I sort of go through just the Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 part of this presentation. And when writing that blog post, I really dug into the issue queue to see what were people talking about with hooks. And the answer is that people, when Drupal 8 was first sort of getting going, people talked about getting rid of hooks and just having events. And then halfway through, that conversation just died and has never been reborn. So I would say I'm with a large degree of confidence, hooks are here to stay for a long time. You'll know about it well in advance.
As a follow-up,
Yes.
Is there a reason why you would want to use a hook instead of an event when you're just creating a new module? Because it seems like all
Yeah.
the power is going to events.
Yeah. So the question is what when you're defining a new module, is there a reason why you would use a hook instead of an event? And that's a really great question that I could add a whole slide about. And that is that there aren't very many events in Drupal core. Drupal core still is very much geared towards hooks. For example, say you wanted to react to a user logging in to the system. In Drupal hooks parlance, there's an event called user login, so hook user login. But there is no such Symfony or Drupal 8 style event for that occurrence. What I like, and I don't know how, what I recommend to myself, what I want to do, is I use this contributed module called Hook Event Dispatcher, which essentially just defines a whole bunch of hooks and dispatches events for each of them. That's all it does. The only thing the module does is define an event for each hook that it wants to. And I believe it has a couple hundred hooks that it has written in it. And if you find, so I started working on a really complicated Drupal 8 site about 3 years ago, and then I changed companies, and I was building that whole site on top of that contrib module because I wanted to deal with events and less so with hooks. And I can pull that up as well. So actually, one of my references, this link here, hooks, events, and event subscribers, is to my blog post. And at the bottom of that blog post, I reference all the parts of the Drupal issue queue where they talked about getting rid of hooks, and then that conversation just sort of went away, as well as the module I'm talking about right now, which is the Hook Events Dispatcher module.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We still have all the time in the world. Are there any?
So for,
Yes.
all this happens in one single process. So you fire up Drupal and it sits in one page and whether it's on Unix or wherever. So the events are all dealt with in there. If you want to build a scalable system, you need to have inter-process communication one way or another. And you parse things off and say, all right, create order, process the order, packing list, everything else. But scatter them. So then instead of sitting and polling on a database queue, are you then suggesting using some just fire and forget? But
Yeah.
you're setting up some services basically and just go.
Yeah, so the question is actually, I had an answer until I tried to redefine the question for the microphone. To build a scalable system, like what makes event systems scalable might be the question. Is it that the implementation of the event dispatching is very lightweight and it fires the events and forgets, was part of the question. I hope I'm getting that right. And yes, so if you were going to design a system, a foundation for a system that could become very complex, then a great place to start, or once you have like all your pieces defined, a great place to start is with an event system. And so let's consider something like, let's consider building a form that a user has to fill out on their website. In Drupal 7, you've probably dealt with hook form alter. So in the case of a form, we have multiple events. We have the form has been loaded. The form contains HTML. It is made up of HTML. Then on this page, the user fills in the form and clicks a submit, and then the form is processed. And then after the processing of that form, whatever else happens, it goes on. So you have a pretty complicated scenario where you could have 100 different modules really want to know about that form. They want to modify that form. They want to react to a valid form submission. They want to react to an invalid form submission. A really good place to think about this in Drupal would be a commerce checkout. So the commerce checkout system for the commerce module is a really complicated form that involves multiple submission points. It's actually multiple forms working together. So the way you might want to start a system like that, of that degree complexity, would actually be to define a lot of events. And your underlining system would essentially just be the part of the system that says, okay, form has loaded, fire the form load event. And then you don't care. The fundamental part of your system doesn't care what happens. And then form has submitted, fire that event. And form was invalid, fire that event. So the system itself becomes really lightweight. It doesn't care necessarily about the reactions. And instead, it is just announcing things that happen. And then all of your components can be as narrow or complex as they need to be for exactly that thing. So, for example, sending an email to the user that their checkout was complete. You could have one really tiny part of the system that only cares about that one part of the complex series of events that are occurring during checkout. And now you can write that code to be very small. So you could have a complicated system that goes through multiple form submits, multiple validations, multiple form loads, and the way you're going to handle that email is with one tiny bit of code that says, like, on the event of checkout complete, send an email. So you've loosely coupled everything so that everything can become specialized and efficient and less error prone. Did I answer your question? Okay. Could you rephrase the question?
At the checkout point, you go, all right, I've taken payment, the order is complete.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to now process everything that sits at the back end of all this, which is create the pack slip, hit the inventory control system, there's a whole myriad of other things, send the email confirmations and all that. I now have to wait to get the kickback, come back to the browser and say, yeah, everything is good. If I want to do that whole process in one go. Whereas all I want to do to make sure is that my order is complete and I've taken payment.
Mm-hmm.
That other process that lies at the back, firing those events as asynchronous events, then have them processed, rather than having a workflow that sits and scans a queue of what to do. So I'm talking large-scale systems, like almost like a banking system, TP monitoring type size system.
Yeah, okay. So if basically, if the system is complex enough, you may want all of this series of subscribers to act completely independently and not be a queue, not have to wait on each other, but just to, yes.
That's the publish and subscribe that I'm kind of thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that case, you would need to deal with something like, you would definitely have to deal with different servers or different threads in PHP. So PHP is PHP blocks until one thing is done, the next thing can happen. So in a world of PHP, if I were to try to define an asynchronous event system in PHP, I would do it by instantiating like new. You would get down to where you're creating new threads that call a different service or a different server and let them know about the thing, and then that thread just dies. So it's much easier to think about in JavaScript because JavaScript is naturally asynchronous. So if you were to do it in JavaScript, then you would say, like, on the click event of submitting this commerce form, once we've validated the form, go ahead and call post to this server, that server, and all the 100 other services or servers that are independent of each other. And your JavaScript being asynchronous doesn't have to wait on the response. So you'd have to distribute the work itself amongst different systems, I guess. Does that better? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So basically, real hard in PHP, but in JavaScript, even like Node.js. So even with where your back end is JavaScript, much easier. Any other questions? Yes.
So that hook event dispatcher module, I've never heard of that, and you said you use that?
Yeah.
What's a use case where you'd want to use that to make an event out of a hook?
Yeah, so what's the use case for using event dispatcher? That is personal preference.
Does it give you more flexibility?
Yes. So I mean, it gives you. So for me, I would rather deal with classes that expect a single event context object that are full of methods. So okay, let's think about a Drupal 7 hook. The context that you get through a Drupal 7 hook, right? it's a bunch of variables. We're getting there. We're getting there. Here we are, right there. So path and argument, or like if you're doing like a theme-related event, pre-processed page, it might be the variables array full of stuff. Like this is just a bunch of data. It is very rare in Drupal 7 to actually get context that is a method, something that helps you respond to that event. But in Symfony, and since the event context is always an object of the class, generally of the class event or something else, then you can start attaching methods to your event. So that, for example, I'm jumping around a bit, but for example, so this event contains some data about the config, but what if you wanted to like go load up that config, maybe make further changes? Like that's a lot of work that the event itself, being an object, can contain for you in the get config method.
So, but you can still do it in hooks. It just gives you an easier, more practical way to do it. Or is there
Yeah.
something you can do when you override it with the event that you couldn't do in the hook?
No, I would say the main use case for that module is developer experience.
Yeah.
I use it because I would rather deal with this.
Right. It makes
than
more
that.
sense.
Yeah. It's more powerful. Also, if I'm building a complicated system where a lot of the customization is not being contributed back, I want to dispatch events. And I want to like simplify the way everybody else works on that project by saying, guess what, y'all? We're doing events. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank y'all very much.